Texto, no one in the bar was expecting him. He entered silently, wearing only a dark coat and a past that no one knew about. But when an arrogant man began to humiliate a young waitress in front of everyone, a presence rose up, not with shouts, not with violence, but with a look, a gesture, and the most powerful silence that place has ever heard. What happens in the next few minutes is not just a confrontation, it is a lesson, a transformation, and a truth that will silence even the loudest of egos. The wind sliced like a blade on the frozen concrete sidewalks. The yellowish lights of old street lamps flickered with each gust, while the melting snow formed dark puddles along the curb. At the end of a street forgotten by GPS apps, a wooden bar with fogged windows glowed under a trembling blue neon sign, Murphy's. The door creaked as Jason Statham walked in. No loud music, no shouting, just the muffled sound of glasses and silverware. The air was warm, welcoming to some, indifferent to others. An old jukebox spun a soft jazz instrumental track, and a bourbon bottle rolled in slow motion across the counter, about to be caught by one of the bartenders. Jason stepped through the door as if he didn't want to be noticed. But he was. The long black coat, the firm shoulders, the slow, almost calculated steps, everything about him drew attention, even when he tried to disappear. He chose a seat near the side wall, where broken mirrors reflected fragments of the room, as if the place were being watched by 1,000 eyes. The waitress, a young woman in a dark apron, her hair hastily tied back, smiled lightly and made a motion to go to him. But before she got there, the peaceful silence was shattered, like broken glass. Near the center of the bar, a man stood up, tall, imposing, dressed like someone who wanted to be seen. Designer blazer, flashy watch, shoes that didn't belong on the sticky floor of that bar. His laugh wasn't the kind that laughs with others, but at them. He held a whiskey glass like it was a trophy, and next to him, 2 women laughed without really wanting to. The man turned to the waitress approaching Jason. He shouted her name, loud enough to draw attention, low enough to sound casual. She stopped, hesitated, and turned back. Jason observed without turning his head, only with his eyes, the kind of gaze that doesn't invade but investigates, the kind of gaze that cuts through. The waitress went back to the man. He started making jokes, the kind that wear irony as charm. But no one was truly smiling. He pretended to compliment her, commented on her looks, her posture, her mistakes. When she dropped a glass trying to clean a table, he applauded, as if he were in a theater. The sound of the glass shattering on the floor echoed like a sharp slap. Jason didn't move, but inside him, something ignited. He wasn't there for this. Not that night. Sitting in silence, he stared at the broken mirror. The voices in the background blended like muffled echoes. His mind wasn't just there. It floated between the shards of the present and the ghosts of the past. That bar. It wasn't just a bar. Not to Jason. It was there years ago that his younger brother used to play piano every Friday night. It was there that genuine laughter lived. It was there that their last conversation happened, before pain took his brother to a place from which he never returned. The waitress, now with teary eyes, bent down to clean the floor. The arrogant man watched her with a half-smile, satisfied to be the center of someone's universe, even if through humiliation. Jason still didn't get up, but his hand slowly left his pocket. His fingers slid across the wood of the table until they found a small silver object, a pendant, round, aged. The initials engraved on it were old, almost faded. He spun it between his fingers with an unusual delicacy for a man known for his fists. Outside, snow was falling again. Inside, time seemed frozen. The laughter faded. An older customer sitting near the jukebox stopped chewing. Another near the bathroom pretended to look at his phone, but his eyes were fixed on Jason. Something was changing in the air, as if a storm were about to start, but no one knew if it would be made of wind or silence. The arrogant man turned again, now louder, now more aggressive. He said something to the waitress, pointing to the floor as if she were beneath him for making a mistake. He didn't shout, he mocked, the kind of cruelty that doesn't need volume to hurt. That's when Jason stopped spinning the pendant. He put it back in his pocket silently, rested both hands on the edge of the table like someone preparing to rise. His shoulders aligned, and his posture gained height effortlessly. And then, he stood up. The sound of the chair sliding back made more noise than any word spoken that night. And it was enough. The bar fell silent. Even the jukebox seemed to understand the weight of that gesture and stopped the music. The arrogant man turned, surprised. He wasn't expecting a reaction, especially not from that figure. Jason simply stared. No anger, no rush. But with a presence as dense as the air itself, everyone froze. The waitress, still kneeling on the floor, looked up. Jason didn't say a single word. He didn't need to. And at that exact moment, the atmosphere shifted. Laughter died. Arrogance lost its stage. And the story, the one no one knew was beginning, took its first step. Jason stands up for the first time in history, without saying anything, without acting aggressively. But his presence, his restrained gesture, his gaze, everything silences the bar. The arrogant man feels the change. The audience does too. And what comes next, no one is prepared to see. Jason remained standing, immersed in a silence that spoke louder than any shout. His eyes, fixed on the arrogant man, carried no fury. They carried memory. It was the kind of gaze that doesn't threaten but reveals what the other tries to hide inside. And in that moment, the arrogance faltered. The man in front of him laughed as a reflex, a forced laugh too loud to be natural. But no one in the bar echoed the sound. His laughter died in the echo. Jason didn't approach, nor did he flinch. His body was still, but his soul seemed to move between memories that still burned. There was weight on his shoulders, but it was an old weight. The kind of burden you can't see but bends the soul from within. Across the room, the jukebox resumed playing as if trying to fill the void that silence had created. But it was too late. The atmosphere had changed. The entire bar now revolved around a single gravitational center, and that center wasn't arrogance. It was devastation wrapped in calm. Jason averted his gaze for the first time. Not like someone retreating, like someone visiting a place inside themselves. His eyes wandered to the piano in the corner of the room. Covered by a faded cloth, it looked forgotten by time, abandoned by nights that once were alive there. It was there, at that piano, that his younger brother used to play. Memories began to flash before Jason's eyes like disconnected scenes. A 12-year-old boy tapping simple notes, smiling through mistakes and hits. The same boy, years later, playing with eyes closed while Jason watched from the back of the bar with quiet pride. And then, the hardest image of all, the piano bench. Empty, a note left on top. A world that collapsed in silence. Jason blinked slowly. There were no tears, but what was in his eyes was deeper than any cry. It was absence. It was echo. The waitress, still kneeling, stood up carefully. Her eyes moved from Jason to the arrogant man, then back to Jason again, as if something inside her was changing, as if a seed of courage were sprouting just from witnessing it. The arrogant man tried to regain control. He tapped lightly on the counter, looked around like someone hoping for approval. No response, not a single supportive glance. Everyone was now tethered to the same gravitational pull. Jason. The arrogant man approached Jason, crossing his arms with fake confidence. His voice tone shifted. No longer mocking, defensive, but Jason didn't respond. He just looked. A gaze like someone who had buried a father, who had held the hand of someone about to pass, who had stood at the edge of the abyss and chose not to fall. That look didn't belong to an actor. It belonged to a survivor. The man in front of him tried to keep his posture, but a slight tremor appeared in his fingers. It was subtle, but visible. Jason took a deep breath, a heavy breath, one that seemed to drag a decade with it. And then, without warning, he leaned slightly forward. It wasn't a threatening gesture. It was intimate, intense. and in a tone so low that no one else could hear, he murmured something. The arrogant man froze. His face lost color, his jaw locked. His eyes for a moment looked like someone who had just been completely exposed. Jason took a step back, unhurried, and sat down again. The bar didn't return to normal, because normal had died there. People were breathing more carefully, as if any sound could break the enchantment that had formed. In the corner, an older customer whispered to another, "That's the guy who went into that fire in Detroit, saved 3 kids, didn't leave even when everything collapsed." Another customer added, "And he disappeared after that. No one heard about him again." The waitress, her eyes fixed on Jason, seemed to understand something she couldn't name. The arrogant man stepped back, not physically, but internally, like someone forced to look in the mirror and not liking what he sees. Jason ran his hand over his face in a slow, tired gesture. There was no hatred in his features, just an old weariness deeply rooted. The jukebox music changed again, a piano, soft, painful. Jason looked toward the instrument, now uncovered, and for a moment he smiled, not with joy, but with longing. In that instant, even without saying a direct word, he had said everything. Jason whispers something to the arrogant man, something no one else hears. But the effect is immediate. The man falters. His arrogance gives way to fear. The mystery looms. What was said? And why does Jason seem so peaceful? The bar was no longer the same place Jason had entered. Now it was a mirror, and everyone was being forced to see themselves reflected in it. The arrogant man was still standing, trying to find some trace of the audience that had supported him minutes before. But what he now saw were different eyes that said, "We see you, truly," and that terrified him. The waitress moved through the room as if floating. Her gaze remained on Jason. It wasn't the type of admiration aimed at an idol. It was the look of someone seeing a man who had survived pain and remained whole, even if cracked. She grabbed a clean towel and returned to the spot where minutes earlier she had been humiliated. She knelt down silently and began cleaning the shards with care, without rush, as if that act was more than a chore. It was a ritual, a rebuilding. Jason didn't look at her, but he knew. In the corner of the bar, the older customer watched. His calloused hands rested on his cane, and a sad smile appeared on his face. He remembered. He knew who Jason was. He remembered the news, the blurry image of a man carrying a child through flames while everyone else fled. That was the same man who now stood before an arrogant nobody, and he didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. The arrogant man, pressed by that invisible weight, walked up to Jason with steps too firm to be authentic. His clenched jaw, his fists, his puffed-out chest, everything about him screamed insecurity disguised as confidence. He reached Jason. Jason remained seated, calm, unshaken. The man said something, the kind of provocation that usually starts fights in seconds, but Jason didn't react. He simply raised his hand, not as a threat, not as an attack, but as if to say, "This ends here." The gesture was small, but its impact was seismic. The arrogant man stepped back half a pace. His gaze wavered. And in that instant, everyone understood. True strength doesn't live in fists. It lives in what you refuse to do, even when you could. At the counter, the bartender, a man who until then had just been serving drinks without getting involved, was now drying a glass more vigorously, trying to hide the emotion in his eyes. He had a son the same age as the waitress, and seeing someone like Jason stand up without violence for something so small touched him in a way he couldn't explain. Across the room, a woman near the door stood up, grabbed her coat, but before leaving, passed by the waitress and whispered something in her ear. A simple gesture, but it drew a discreet, timid, sincere smile. The arrogant man, now more fragile than seemed possible just minutes before, returned to his seat. Tried to laugh again, but the sound wouldn't come. Jason remained seated, staring at the empty glass in front of him. No need for words. His silence spoke, screamed. The waitress finished cleaning. She stood up, and as she passed Jason, she left something on the table. A small napkin, carefully folded. Jason didn't open it immediately. He just touched it with his fingertips. He knew what was there, not words, but gratitude. The arrogant man stood up again, a last effort to reclaim what he'd lost. He approached Jason and made a move to touch his shoulder, perhaps to provoke, perhaps to test. But before his hand could get close, Jason raised his eyes. And only his eyes were enough. He raised his hand again, not with force, with compassion, as if to say, "You're already defeated, but not by me, by yourself." The arrogant man lowered his hand, took a step back, and for the first time silently apologized with his eyes. Jason didn't nod, nor did he reject it. He simply stood up. He walked slowly to the covered piano, ran his fingers over the cloth, closed his eyes, and there, in one eternal second, time stood still. Jason disarms the arrogant man without even touching him. His compassion overcomes the other man's ego. But then he walks over to the old piano, as if something important is about to happen. A secret, a revelation, a memory that is about to be opened. The cloth covering the piano slid off like dry snow as it was removed by Jason's hands. The dark wood, marked by years of use, revealed small cracks, stains from forgotten glasses, scratches from old strings. But there was something sacred about that piano, as if each note ever played on it still echoed inside the walls. Jason ran his fingers gently over the keys without pressing them. He touched the silence, and the silence responded. Behind him, no one dared interrupt. The waitress watched from afar, eyes fixed, breath held. The arrogant man was no longer arrogant. He sat hunched over like someone who finally understands the weight of himself. Jason didn't play a melody, but he played everyone present. A sound vibrated, not from the strings, but from memories. In Jason's mind, one particular night returned like a movie scene. His brother, still young, playing Moon River with closed eyes, while the entire bar listened in silence. It was the first time Jason saw pain turn into beauty. That was the only moment when his brother seemed to carry no weight. Music freed him, but no one realized that, even so, he was drowning. Jason opened his eyes. The memory faded like smoke, but the feeling remained. He stepped away from the piano and walked back to his seat. But before sitting down, he stopped in front of the waitress. She looked small beside him. But that night, something inside her had grown, something that was already there. It just needed to be awakened. Jason placed his hand inside his coat pocket. He pulled something out with care, like holding a relic, a pendant, aged silver, round, with initials engraved by hand. A.S. Without saying a word, he held the waitress's hand, turned the palm upward, and placed the object there. Her fingers closed instinctively, but her eyes, they trembled. She knew, she felt, even before looking at what it was. Jason gave a slight nod. Not a, "Take this," but a, "It's yours." And then he returned to his seat, sat, and remained. The bartender just a few feet away watched with a kind of reverence usually reserved for churches. The woman who had almost left earlier sat back down, as if the bar was now the only place she wanted to be. The older customer took a deep breath, his cane gripped tightly in his hands. The people in the bar didn't know exactly what was happening, but they knew what they were feeling. A silent transformation, as if that space had been purified. The arrogant man, now just a broken man, looked at Jason, and with his gaze, something inside him apologized again. This time, sincerely. Jason didn't smile, but there was peace in his features. The waitress opened her hand, looked at the pendant, the engraved letters. Her eyes widened. Her mouth slightly opened. Her world froze. She brought her other hand to her mouth, holding back tears, and for the first time in years, remembered something she had buried. Those initials belonged to her brother. The waitress realizes that the pendant belongs to her deceased brother, someone she thought was disconnected from any history of that place. But Jason was connected to him somehow. How? Why? What is yet to be revealed? The waitress remained still, holding the pendant as if it had real weight, not of metal but of memory. The letters engraved in the silver, AS, belonged to the brother she had lost years ago. An accident, a silence never resolved. She never knew what happened in the final minutes of his life. The pain remained suspended, floating between questions and regrets. She looked at Jason with tear-filled eyes, still without understanding. Jason didn't look away. He didn't explain. He just allowed her to feel, because sometimes truth needs no words. Slowly, she walked toward him, sat beside him, still clutching the pendant tightly between her fingers. The memories began to emerge. Her brother going to the bar to play piano, the day he never came back, the funeral with no answers, the last note he left, which said nothing. She looked at him, and Jason, silently, confirmed with his eyes. Yes, he had been there. Not as a savior, not as a hero, but as a witness, and perhaps as the one who carried the pain she couldn't. In the past, Jason had been present at the accident. He tried to save him. He failed. But among the wreckage, he found the pendant. He kept it for years, as a reminder, as penance. And now, he returned it. As redemption. The waitress pressed the pendant to her chest, not from attachment, but from connection. Jason lowered his head slightly, not as an apology, but as reverence. At the bar, the old customer stood up with effort. Leaning on his cane, he walked over to Jason. He stopped beside him, and without saying a single word, placed a hand on his shoulder. Firm, grateful. Jason looked up and saw in him the same pain he carried, the pain of someone who has lost too much, but never stopped loving. The arrogant man watched it all, silently. The man he was before had vanished. What remained was a reflection, a man who, perhaps for the first time, understood what compassion is. The waitress stood up, went to the kitchen, washed her face, returned with her hair down, eyes steady. Something had changed in her. She was no longer just the bar's waitress. She was a woman connected to a story much bigger than she imagined. Jason looked at the clock, and it was time to leave. He paid the bill with a generous amount, not to impress but to give thanks. He nodded toward the bartender with a simple gesture, looked once more at the piano, then at the waitress. She nodded back as if to say, "I understand now." Jason walked slowly through the room. Each step seemed to carry a decade. As he opened the door, a gust of cold wind swept into the bar, like a breath of reality. He disappeared into the night mist. In the parking lot, he walked to his car. Snow fell in soft flakes. The street was empty, silent. As he approached the vehicle, he noticed something attached to the side mirror. A small piece of paper, carefully folded, taped with an improvised strip. Jason looked around. Not a soul in sight. He took the paper, opened it slowly. The words were simple, handwritten in faded blue ink. "I know who you are. You taught me how to see." Jason read it again, and froze. The words didn't come from a stranger. They came from someone who had witnessed it all and understood it all. They came from the waitress, but it wasn't just gratitude. It was a reminder that he, even without knowing it, still had a purpose, Jason closed his eyes. The note clutched between his fingers, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to smile. Jason holds the note in his hand, standing in the snow, his heart heavy and light at the same time. He takes a deep breath, and in the silence of the street, something sparks inside him. He knows his mission is not over yet. 2 days had passed since Jason had left the bar. Snow now blanketed the parking lot like a virgin shroud. The footprints from that last night had disappeared, but something deeper, invisible, remained in that place. Murphy's bar was no longer just a lost spot on the map. It was now the stage of a change no one could ignore. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The background music wasn't just a soundtrack, it was a tribute. In the corner of the room, the piano, once covered and forgotten, now shined with fresh polish. The keys, carefully cleaned, breathed again. The waitress, now wearing a small pendant around her neck, moved through the bar with a different posture. There was something in the way she smiled, something in her gaze that met others, as if, finally, she had stepped back into her place in the world. She still didn't know exactly what Jason had said to the arrogant man, but she didn't need to, because what remained was what he didn't say. It was the invisible impact. The arrogant man, by the way, hadn't returned since. Some said he'd left town, others that he started therapy. The truth is, for someone who lives at the center of their own arrogance, being confronted by someone who doesn't need to raise his voice is like being stripped bare. That night, the bar welcomed only a few customers. The mood was calm, almost poetic. And in that comfortable silence, Jason returned. He entered without announcement, without rush, wore the same coat, the same firm steps, the same distant look. But something in him was different. The weight was still there, yes, but now, shared. As he entered, he didn't look to the sides, he just went to the counter. The waitress saw him and her eyes lit up. She didn't run to him, didn't smile wide. She simply nodded, and that gesture said more than 1,000 words. The bar owner appeared behind the counter. He had been there the night of the confrontation. Hadn't said anything until now, but in that moment, he placed a glass in front of Jason. It was water. Simple, pure, what one offers a pilgrim. Jason didn't drink it, he just looked, and muttered a thank you without sound, only with his eyes. The jukebox music changed. Piano. It was the same song from years ago, the one his brother used to play. Jason turned, looked at the piano, and smiled. The waitress walked over, placed a hand on the pendant around her neck, and touched his shoulder with the other. It wasn't a gesture of idolization, it was of connection, of understanding. Jason stood up, took 2 steps toward the piano, and for the first time sat down. His fingers touched the keys with hesitation, but the first chords were enough for everyone in the bar to stop. Everyone, even time. The melody was simple, slow, but each note carried a universe. It wasn't perfection, it was truth. The waitress sat at one of the nearest tables. The bartender stopped cleaning glasses. The older customer let his cane slide down and just listened. It was more than music. It was a wordless prayer, a letter written in sound. When the last note floated through the air, Jason remained there, motionless. He took a deep breath, and then stood up. There were no applause, not because it wasn't beautiful, but because it was sacred. He walked to the door, looked at the waitress. She smiled, and then he left. The snow had stopped. The sky was clear. Jason walked toward his car. His coat swayed gently in the wind. The world around him seemed to have turned down the volume, as if the universe was quietly watching. As he got into the car, he looked into the rearview mirror. The waitress stood at the bar window watching him. She didn't wave. She just placed her hand over the pendant and whispered something no one heard. But that changed everything. Some heroes don't shout. Jason started the engine. The motor purred softly, almost like a goodbye. He didn't know where his next destination would be. But now, he remembered why he walked. Jason leaves without glory, without an audience. But something changed forever in that bar, and in the lives of those who were there. He wasn't looking for redemption, but he left a trail of healing. And now, perhaps, he is healed too. In a world where many shout to prove they are right, Jason Statham shows us that true power lies in not having to shout. If this story touched you in any way, if you believe that respect, presence, and silent compassion still matter, then subscribe to the channel now and leave a like. Activate the bell, share with whoever needs to hear this. Because sometimes it's a story like this that changes the way we see everything. And remember, some heroes don't shout. They just show up.